the left in those years? How do you analyze that stage of the country?
Now, we have to understand the historical struggles that Kenya has passed by for us then to bring it to the Moi regime era and then try to put it on a class perspective for at least our readers and our views to be able to understand what kind of political system dominated us during the dictator Moi. And if the problem would be then the individual who is the dictator Moi, or the systemic problem that had existed. From the Communist Party perspective, we understand that after the independence in our country, and in fact we call it a sham independence, we had a group of retrogressive nationalists that was led by our founding father, Jomo Kenyatta, that took the reins of power. And they wielded those reins of power only to benefit a few people at that time, which in our own analysis are only Comprado or the national bourgeoisie. After the death of the reactionary Jomo Kenyatta, who was actually one of the biggest landowners in this country, then Moi, who was the vice president, took over power. But Moi only perfected, the art of Jomo Kenyatta. And that means he entrenched the neo-colonial state. He made concessions for the global, the international capital. He made concession for the international finance capital from the IMF and World Bank. He made concession from the big business players in our country. He made concession for big metropolis and multinationals to do business in our country, where business actually just meant modern day slavery, where we had Kenya being reduced as a raw material exporter. We had Kenya only being used as a place to exploit almost, zero pay in terms of labor. So that was the typical dictator Moi's government. And in fact, in terms of democracy, Moi was a darling of the Western democracies. So he pursued the United States foreign policy that were influencing their client states abroad to ban communism as a political ideology in our country. Moi then went further to even implement certain acts that actually proclaimed communist literature to be seditious in our country. And for that reason, we will find that many progressives or communists that were organizing in our country were either forced to go underground, and some of them had to seek refuge out of the country as political dissidents or political refugees. And the climax of it is 1982, because the oppression that was being exercised by Moi's government could not be tolerated by the progressives. And a few people then decided that they would organize for a coup against the KANU One Party dictatorship. And again, that only exacerbated the problem of the poor people, because it led to the crackdown of progressive. It led to an attack on the organizations of the left that were mainly underground, and mass arrest and harassment of families. And in that way, we realized that Moi was still able to hold firm in political power until there is the second round of pressure that came during what we call the reintroduction of multi-party through an act of parliament, and that introduced the politics of multipartyism in Kenya. And after fighting for a political, political parties in Kenya, the multi-partyism in Kenya, but it was a very Eurocentric or, a very American-driven agenda in our country, because they call it a multi-party system, but only the capitalist parties were allowed, registration. So then people realized that Moi had to be kicked out, and the mass organizations, the progressive, the trade unions, and progressive religious institutions started, a movement that led to the 2000 election of the long-term leader of opposition, which was Mwai Kibaki. And at that time, then we had Moi being thrown out of power. But the aspects of Moism, the aspect of Kanuism have stayed with us to date, because now we are being dominated by Moi's children. The money that he took from the public still continue to circulate among the minority, and even to date, we can see one of his single-handed appointees that he wanted to take political powers from him in 2002, the outgoing president, Mr. Kenyatta, is a product of Moism. And even Raila Amolo Odinga, who was appointed as one of the leaders in the KANU towards the tail end of Moi's government, was one of the political contenders in these presidential elections. And we had the KANU youth, which was horribly known as YK92, the brutal youth wing of the KANU. The leader is now at the realm, actually has been declared the president-elect, that is Mr. Ruto. So in 2002, people realized that the problem was not only Moi, but it was entrenched in a political system that is dominated by minority, and that political system was neo-colonial, it was outward-looking, and it was not able to sort out our internal problems. And that, birthed the struggle for the Constitution review. And that struggle was the most horrendous, because many people lost their lives. In fact, the poor people sacrificed themselves and martyred in the streets of Nairobi, in Kisumu, and in the main cities like Mombasa, to make sure that the Constitution review will take place. And it was only until 2010 that the 2010 Constitution, that is highly progressive, was birthed to guide the Kenyan community.
What social elements make up the SDP at that time, and how did the organization evolve until it became the current Communist Party?
The Social Democratic Party of Kenya that was registered in the 90s was never Communist Party of Kenya, but it was a Social Democratic Party of Kenya. So it's clear in our mind that the people who were organizing under the umbrella of communism were organizing in the aspects of underground movement. And that history can be seen in, let us say, the Mwakenya movement or the DTM movement that were mainly student-driven, and some of them were led by lecturers of the University of Nairobi and Lecturers Union. And they were mainly informal organizations that were underground, that were organizing covertly, because organizing of any communist or movement overtly will either earn you a long jail term, or even you will be murdered by the government of the day. So the home that the revolutionaries found that they could use to contest for political power was the Social Democratic Party at that time. So that was the party that was agitating for reforms. That was the party that was trying to say that the poor and the rich people can live, together in harmony without having to threaten the existence of one another. So the party was purely a social democratic party of Kenya until in later years, in 2007, when a few revolutionaries within the party started the process to drive the party to the left. And even that did not succeed as much, because the party, for a moment, fell in the hand of reactionaries. And at that time, again, the revolutionaries, which were mainly the youth wing of the party, at that time called the Social Democratic Party of Kenya, the youth wing of the party, where I was majorly involved in, are the people who started the process to rescue the party from the kleptocracy that had actually entered into the party and was driving the party towards the right. And even the current Minister for Health, Mutahi Kagwe, was part of the offensive. Njeri Ndwiga was part of the offensive. And the youth wing of the political party had to come out and redeem the party's dignity and, rejoice in its glory. And that's how the left debate started in the Social Democratic Party of Kenya. And that led to the general secretary at that time was James Orengo, that had to leave the party unceremoniously to join the NAC to be able to be electable in Ugenya constituency. So we can see that the Communist Party of Kenya is a product of the struggle, and in many ways, many Kenyans have paid a big price, either in organizing it through underground movement or overtly through constitutional review or agitation, or even through judicial activism. And the left in our countries have been part and parcel of the struggles that we have seen, and the victories on behalf of the poor and the working class in our country. Now, in 2010, when we got the new constitution, that is when the revolutionaries declared victory within the Social Democratic Party of Kenya, and the amendment of the documents of the Social Democratic of Kenya were done and filed by the Registrar of Political Parties to declare it a Marxist-Leninist party that follows a clear guide, a clear scientific line for the proletariat revolution. However, for practical reasons, and since the 2013 elections was just coming aboard, the leadership of the Social Democratic Party of Kenya, even after that momentous victory, they retained the name Social Democratic for all practical purposes, because SDP was already known among the masses, and there was a debate in the party that could help us to perform well in the 2013 election processes. Unfortunately, that hysteria of Social Democratic Party of Kenya did not even help us to get seats in parliament. In fact, we performed very dismally and were only able to get a few member of county assemblies positions. And in that way, the process then started to change the name from Social Democratic Party of Kenya to the Communist Party of Kenya. And one of the main reasons is we had to call ourselves, what we are, because the communists belong to the Communist Party of Kenya, not the Social Democratic Party of Kenya. So the discussion then started in 2010 that will then evolve to birth, a new communist party that is registerable under bourgeois legality and is able to participate in electoral processes.
Okay, now that you mentioned about the constitution, since 2010, Kenya has had a new constitution, which replaced the 1963 constitution. Do you think this text allowed the country's situation to improve?
The Kenyans have always been defiant to the colonial constitution and even the neo-colonial, the so-called Manchester constitution, that actually placed the powers in the hands of a few. The democracy was rather controlled among the few elites. And in fact, they only entrenched, the managers of the system on behalf of the bourgeoisie or the rich people in our country. So, 2010 Constitution was a very momentous moment for the working class. First of all, it was emotional because our fallen brothers and sisters that were fighting in the streets demanding for the constitutional change, it was a day to remember them. It was a day to give dignity to those martyrs. And the 2010 Constitution came out with the most progressive. In fact, if you look at the issues that now we are dealing with, even now, what we are calling the evangelical or the Christian fundamentalist. The 2010 Constitution is very clear that Kenya is not a theocracy and there shall never be any state religion. That to me is a very progressive start. And then in the preamble, the Kenyan Constitution 2010 puts it even much in a very clear way that all power is bestowed on the people of Kenya. And for every given time, they can give that power indirectly or directly to the people to govern them. And when they give it directly through they can exercise it indirectly through the elected leaders, or they can even exercise those power directly because it belongs to the people and no one else. Then if you come to the human rights, the social rights, you come to the clauses that are dealing with governance, you come to issues to do with oversight, and even on issues to do with foreign policy. By and large, we can say that the Constitution 2010 is a very revolutionary constitution, and even we can see that if there's a responsible government that is interested then to entrench the pro-people policies and ideas, they have no other document other than the 2010 Constitution that they can rely on. They just need to clarify some ambiguity that was introduced, by the ruling elite, and then interpret it on the side of the working class. Because Constitution is a tool of the state. And each person, each class that is in power interprets the Constitution in the favor of that class. So, for example, if you come to land equation, the Constitution 2010 has been misinterpreted that there are private land, and then there is public land, and then there is community land. But you realize that the community and public land have always not taken precedence. Actually, they tail back, but the private land always take precedence because the Constitution is interpreted by the rulers. And if that ruler, those rulers come from one class, then they interpret the Constitution to favor the rich. The judiciary will interpret it. The executive and the parliament will interpret the 2010 Constitution in the way that only favors, a minority. But if the Communist Party of Kenya was to be held in government, then we will start from the 2010 Constitution to entrench progressive reforms, to provide social rights, to provide human rights, to expand, access to basic services like healthcare, like decent housing with dignity, like the privilege to have, a job with dignity. And in that way, we will start a process towards building socialism. And that is what the 2010 Constitution all about. But also having said that, remember communism has an end goal to defeat all authorities. And in fact, a constitution, even though we can use it to bring reforms, we can use it to give services to the poor and the working class people, but the end game is the end of constitutionalism. That means constitutions are only a transition. The worker state is only a transition. And even all authorities that are bestowed in the communist movement is only a transition to no authority. Because our end game is to seek man and woman that is advanced, a moral man and woman ready for his continental, intercontinental duties that do not need any authority to impose a will upon them. Because now we see that the 2010 Constitution has been interpreted to then impose the will of minority against the will of majority. We will reinterpret it to impose the will of the workers against the people who oppress them. So in the final analysis, we say that 2010 Constitution was a leap in the struggle, and we can use it to advance the struggle for the working class in this country.
Now that you've been organizing the workers and peasants through the Revolutionary Vanguard Party, what is the CPK's analysis on the current situation in Kenya? The economy has grown in recent years, but it seems that this has not necessarily improved the situation of the population.
What really determines the development of a country is the stages in which the productive forces are at. So we can say that since independence or pre-independence or post-independence, the productive forces of Kenya has grown, but the benefits of the workers have been robbed by the factory owners. The benefit of the farmers have been robbed by big landowners. So why is it that Kenya is so rich, or Africa is so rich, but then the majority of the African people are poor? We are poor because we are being robbed by a minority class in Africa, which falls under the comprado bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie. And they rob us of our labor at the farm. They rob us of our labor in the factory. Then after that, they turn us to the shopkeepers, to the supermarket owners that literally do not create anything but broker again. Then they surrender us to the landlord to continue again to suck more blood from the poor people in this country. So the wealth that has been generated in the last several decades in this country is concentrated in a super minority in our country. And it is upon the the majority of the population to organize themselves politically, led by the Communist Party of Kenya, which is the Workers' Party, to now wrest that power. How can that situation be solved? We can only solve that contradictions within the neo-colonial Kenyan society, or what I may call the turbo capitalist society, through taking the political power from those who are board of directors of the minority, the board of directors of the bourgeoisie, and bring it under the able leadership of the workers through their political party. When we do that, then the first thing we will do, of course, is to expropriate the expropriators, to take the wealth from the robbers and bring it back to the workers, to take the wealth from the hoarders and bring it to the workers, to take the wealth from the landlord and bring it to the tenants, take the wealth from, the big multinational farms and bring it back to the people who produce the wealth. So the contradiction of an equality and what the so-called development, when in our position, we see that the development in our country is only geared towards, external beneficiaries. For example, if you look at the plantation businesses, you realize that the people that are involved in plantation business that are mainly local people are underpaid, they are malnourished, they are actually, killing themselves in a very slow way, since they're even using difficult chemicals on those big plantations. They are being exercised to hard labor. And sometimes even the people who employ them do not respect the rule of law in terms of the minimum wage. So in that way, we see that in a country of so much riches, we still have people who die of hunger. We have people who die of curable diseases like malaria. We have people who die, of even curable diseases like TB. We have children that are malnourished. They're suffering from marasmus and kwashiorkor in a country where the political leaders, are suffering from obesity because they have stolen so much that they have almost 8 meals in a day. They wake up and have some breakfast, and by 10 o'clock, they have what they are calling heavy tea. Even they have adopted the language of the colonizer. Before they have, at 1 o'clock, they have a three-stage meal. And before they even forget it, at 4 o'clock, they still have another tea before they retire for dinner. And then after dinner, they can then retire for drinks for the rest of the night. And for that kind of life, when people are burning money in expensive malls, while the poor people continue to eke life out of nothing in informal neighborhoods of Nairobi, in the rural poor neighborhoods, then we can see the class disparity that exists in the Kenyan society. So we can say that Kenya is rich, but that riches in Kenya has been robbed and is only being under the firm control of a few people or a few families.
Okay, we'll divert a bit to go to the question 5, based on the unions. Now, Kenya is part of several regional blocs, amongst which the East African Community and the African Economic Community, or the African Union. What is your opinion on the role of these organizations?
First of all, as long as those unions are any union, whether you call it African Union or the East African Union or the East African Bloc or the Central Bloc, as so long as they see capitalism as the only way to organize the society, then those unions, we can say they are a dead start. In fact, African Union is only an organization to lobby for the benefits of African presidents and dictators. Look at if we see, for example, in African Union, they are always defending the presidency of each other, but they are not for the development of the people. In fact, African Union has been the most disappointing union. Of course, when Uhuru Kenyatta and now William Samoei Ruto were under the investigation of International Criminal the ICC, the International Criminal Court, at that time they camouflaged among the African Union, and they were trying to drive the Pan-Africanist agenda. But it was only in rhetoric and not in content. So Communist Party of Kenya is a Pan-Africanist organization. And Communist Party of Kenya hold a very radical view that a free, united, liberated Africa is only possible under scientific socialism. In fact, Pan-Africanism is the objective, and the software that takes us to that objectivity is scientific socialism. There are certain debates that has taken place before. For example, there was the debate between Julius Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of Ghana and the founding father of Tanzania. And the debates were do we need to unite piecemeal, like for example, the Central and the Southern and the Eastern Bloc, or do we need continental unity at once? But I think that debate has already been overtaken. And we all agree that any unity that advances a pro-people, a united free Africa from capitalism and imperialism is welcome, whether it is piecemeal or universal. The second debate is that what is possible? Do we have African socialism or socialist Africa? I think such debates have already been debunked by the intellectuals of the left, like Abdul Raham Mohammed Babu, or in his book African Socialism or Socialist Africa. And now Communist Party of Kenya is convinced that only under scientific socialism we can see a liberated Africa. And once everything has been declared as science, then it is universal. So we don't have to name it either whether it is African socialism or Western socialism, but we have to look at what we call the immortal science of Marxist-Leninism, which is our principal guide and our light that continue to illuminate our paths towards the total victory of the continent.
Kenyan security, and that is the country sent troops to Somalia in 2011 to fight against Al-Shabaab. What do you think of this type of military mission?
Now, first of all, the overall policy is that we do not allow or accept imperialist forces in our country. So far, our leaders have let us down. They have opened our airspace. They have opened our naval spaces to, the United States and the British military equipment and personnel here. Of course, the Communist Party of Kenya remains hostile to such moves by imperialist forces to interfere with our internal affairs. In terms of Somalia, we have a different policy because we have seen that there was a lot of terrorist attacks from Somalia. But it looks like the Kenyan government was helpless to control the terrorists in our country. So for a moment, we supported the military offensive against the extreme Al-Shabaab organizations in Somalia, which were basically warlords. And we realized that the warlords in Somalia will then use the Kenyan economy to launder the money that they have either gotten from piracy or illegal and criminal activities in their country. So in that move, we applauded the government of the day for taking the people's security, especially after the unfortunate massacre of the students in Garissa. And for sure, everybody can agree that after the Kenyan military went on an offensive in Somalia, we've had very minimal cases of terrorism. However, we also have to unveil the hypocrisy within Mr. Kenyatta's administration, because now the Kenyan military went under AMISON, and it's like we were using our soldiers only to earn profit from them. So you realize that the money that was gotten from AMISON is what probably the political elite in our country are robbing the people who are putting their lives in the front line to protect the Kenyan borders and to make us safe. So in as much as we may disagree with the arrangement that the Kenyan government and AMISON has and the plight of the personnel that are fighting on the war front to try and make us safe, but we think in terms of foreign policy, ideally we did a good thing to go to Somalia and to try and stop terrorism from its origin. The second comment on that is that terrorism must also be fought in terms of socioeconomic welfare of the people. Because when you have most young people and young men and women who are desperate, who are dying, then they can fall into such extremist ideologies. And that is what the government of the day has not appreciated. And finally, that the war, an attack on Somalia, or what you call the war on terrorism, has also been used with the government of the day to step on the people's rights. Like, for example, the surveillance that was installed by Safaricom, which is a private entity and paid for by the taxpayers' money at an exorbitant price. It never works when, when high-end murders or political murders have taken place in Nairobi. But people, were calling for the surveillance network in Nairobi, and the government managed to convince the public opinion that they will, be able to be much safer when their personal rights have been stepped on. So we have seen both sides of terrorism being used either to step on people's right to profiteer. But wherever it has been used to protect the people, then I think the Communist Party of Kenya must applaud the administration of the day. And the most unfortunate thing is that the anti-terrorism laws in our country has also been used to profile a community. Like, for example, the Kenyan Somali has been ethnically profiled, and there was an ethnic attack against the Kenyan Somali by the Uhuru administration, and we had several of them incarcerated, imprisoned, and even taken back to unsafe places in Somalia. So we can see mixed upness there in terms of the policy of the day. But according to the Communist Party of Kenya, that any attempt to fight terrorism or development has always had a hidden agenda of either to profit or to make money, especially that our government, is more of a pro-capitalist government.
And in the recent times, there have been a series of military coups in African countries such as Sudan, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, amongst others, to which is added the civil war in Ethiopia. What do you think this situation is due to?
First of all, Africa is under attack. The destabilization of the African governments are majorly as a result of interference with the United States in the internal affairs and their Western allies, like the interference of French government in West Africa. We have seen government faults like Ivory Coast. Now the Malian government has just issued a statement that the French government has actually flouted their rules and are sending planes in their airspace to deliver lethal weaponry to extreme right-wing and Islamic, extremists in Mali that are actually a threat to the Malian government. If you look at the unfortunate incident in South Sudan, where after the revolution had started, we have the Riyadh government, the Saudi Arabian government, and with their United States as allies and Israel coming in to interfere with the internal, affairs of Sudan and installing, a military regime there. We have seen in South Sudan the race for oil. So Africa as a continent is actually very rich, and there is only two ways to exploit Africa. The most obvious way is that the United States and their Western so-called democracy always want to install a puppet government. And like, for example, what happened in Ivory Coast was to install the neoliberal kleptocrat called Ouattara, and then to overthrow Laurent Gbagbo. And this has happened in Central African Republic. This continues to happen even in our elections here in Kenya. It was interesting, yesterday when we see the Raila Odinga side and the William Ruto side, they went to pay homage to the United States government. And the United States Embassy in Nairobi was very pleased to post their photos, how they are discussing how to entrench the democratic tendencies in Kenya. But in actual sense, the United States Embassy in Nairobi is nothing but a CIA spy agency. And the idea, their main role in our country is to interfere with our internal democracy, to interfere with our processes. So in that way, I could say that Africa is under attack. Africa is poor because it is being robbed. If you look at the biggest country in the continent, Congo has enough resources that can feed the continent, but the imperialist and the metropolitan forces, the multinational forces in Congo will never allow peace to take place in Congo. They want to divide that country. They want to make it vulnerable. They want to loot gold and other mineral resources in Congo. They want to cause war. So if they fail to install a puppet, then they start to finance reactionary elements, divisions through either, if they can manage, they do it like the British did in our country. They divide us through ethnic lines. If there is a different religious grouping, then they set the Islamic community against the Christian community. And in that way, once they divide a country, then they prepare a fertile ground to then loot from it. So I could say, by and large, the wars in Africa are mainly imperialist, and we should be able to, to bring that light to the governments of the day and even tech governments as the left-wing forces to be able to neutralize the forces of the West.
Speaking of Kenya's relationship with the international world, Kenya is one of the main recipients of Chinese credit in Africa, including a millionaire investment in the Standard Gauge Railway project between Nairobi and Mombasa. What is your opinion of what some voices denounce as an abusive maneuver by China towards developing countries with these credits?
China is the future of the planet. In fact, we have a lot of similarities as African people with the Chinese Cultural Revolution. China was colonized by the most brutal, imperialist forces. That was Japanese at that time. And Kenya was colonized by the British. The British has continued to dominate these countries in terms of, giving loans, and putting unnecessary bureaucracies in terms of our development. In fact, when we remain the permanent ally of British and the United States, it has brought a lot of underdevelopment. It's only by the arrival of China that the United States, financial capital organizations like IMF and World Bank has become jealous. But if you look at the Chinese presence in Africa, China has accelerated development in terms of infrastructure, has removed bureaucracies, and even, review the loan arrangements between African countries. If you look at a country like Angola, that they have managed to reduce substantially the poverty index there, and the supremacy of the management of the Chinese community under the Communist Party of China has proven to bring, progressive development. So a country like China is a country to admire. And if there are any flaws that are in the Chinese socialist experiment, it will be irresponsible for us to criticize those flaws based on tribal bigotry, or not tribal bigotry, but racist bigotry, and advanced racism by profiling the Chinese people in our country. So we see a lot of possibilities with the Chinese capital in Africa. We see a lot of cultural similarities with the Chinese people, and the Communist Party of Kenya has no hostility towards China. In fact, we will want to perfect our relationship with the Chinese people. We want to share our experiences, and we draw a lot of knowledge from the leader of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, our chairman, Mao, we call him in the party. So there can be excesses in terms of the Chinese companies working in Kenya, but those excesses must be treated in their own merit. But the biggest problem is that there is a lot of Western-sponsored anti-Chinese propaganda in our country. The big media stations or international media stations like BBC and CNN are here to parrot against China and the Chinese socialist experiment. We have another big attack that is mainly sponsored through the Western non-governmental organizations to set the African people against the Chinese people. But we are happy as the Communist Party of Kenya that they have been losing, and that China has proven to be a genuine friend. And even when we were facing an electoral process in our country, we did not see the Chinese Secretary General or or Chinese leadership trying to interfere, because the Chinese people have a cool policy towards Africa. It's called the policy of non-interference. So in as much as the Communist Party of Kenya will not mind a CPC interfering or doing an intervention in the Kenyan politics, as so long as they can advance our struggle politically. But we still take it at peace that their policy of non-interference in Africa has contributed enormously in terms of people-to-people love between the two great, heroic people. So we look forward to learn from our brothers and sisters in China. We want to learn from their mistakes, and we also want to continue to build our socialist experiment here in the continent. And we may not want to import the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but we will build our own revolution here in Kenya, and also build alliances with other left-wing organizations in Africa. And in that way, we can have a united, African continent based on a clear, a pro-people, scientific, socialist policy. And that is the objective of the Communist Party of Kenya. And at the tail end, I will also say that the Communist Party of Kenya is just not a Pan-Africanist or a national organization, but we are also an internationalist organization. That means we are in solidarity with all the oppressed people of the world. We are anti-capitalist, we are anti-imperialist, we support the Chinese people, we support even the creation of an alternative centers of power, whether those powers, for example, Russia, Venezuela, Brazil, South Africa. And in the words of Hugo Chavez, we say that the world is much safer if we have a multipolar world not the big boy in terms of prefect in the name of the United States that want to hit our heads. They want to prefect us. They want to determine what we eat. They want to determine, how we relate even to our people in Africa here. So we want to reiterate that the Communist Party of Kenya supports the multipolar world, and we are totally against any war, any imperialist war. Of course, the only war we are willing to sacrifice it all is a class war. So that's what brings our internationalist nature. We are in solidarity with the great people of Palestine that are struggling against, the Zionist regime under the apartheid Israel. We are in solidarity with our brothers and sisters from Western Sahara that are fighting against, the Moroccan king for stealing, their freedom, for denying their women and children their dignity. So we are in solidarity with all the oppressed people of the world.
Now, the final most question to you, Mr. Omole, is that the CPK has just participated in the presidential election that were held on 9th August this year. What were main proposals that you, as the party, made to the population of Kenya?
Maybe to start off is to make it clear that the Communist Party of Kenya do not see bourgeois election as a way to liberate the Kenyan people, the Kenyan poor, the Kenyan workers. In fact, we consciously made that decision to participate in bourgeois election based on certain premises, and even published a document to guide the masses, to guide the cadres on the reasons why we participate in bourgeois election. And that document can be read from our website. It's called On the 2022 elections, Kenyans to think outside the box. One of the primary objectives where the Communist Party of Kenya took part in this election was to, if we don't take part when the masses are activated politically, then we will be abandoning the poor workers only to the reactionary ideas of the ruling elite. Have we done our work in terms of spreading our ideas in Kenya? I think the Communist Party of Kenya is a force. It's a big force for us. And we can say that the Communist Party of Kenya now is known at a national and international level. So we have sufficiently done so. The second one was to expose the contradiction between the neo-colonial turbo-capitalist Kenya. And we have done so. And even in our analysis, we had seen two factions, the Raila Odinga-led faction and the William Samoei Ruto-led, coalition. And we can see that they pretended to be protagonists. But that pretense in terms of being protagonist was only in form but not in content. In fact, they have the same class origin, and their attitude towards the oppressed stratas of the Kenyan societies are one. So we were able to see William Samoei Ruto, who is a Christian fundamentalist that is being supported by the evangelicals from the West, and a kleptocrat who has arisen from what is calling from ashes, or from a chicken farmer, to a rich person who is a kleptocrat, who is actually a corrupt person leading one wing of the coalition, and attacking the other side of Raila Amolo Odinga, who is a non-imperialist stooge. In fact, if you look at Raila Odinga, look at his positions in the continent. If you look at his position in Ivory Coast, you will realize that he supported the French-led offensive there. And he has always taken a position against the people of Palestine by supporting Israel, mainly to receive arms. And if you look at his position, Raila Odinga's position on the liberation of Western Sahara people, he has always sided with the Morocco king. So we have seen an outright imperialist stooge, and another ethnic, tribal bigot in the name of William Samoei Ruto, who hides, under the umbrella of Christianity to whip emotions of the poor people, and realize that he can use it, to lie to the people, to arise to arise to a political position. But there has been a big improvement. When I was growing up as a child, there was always, raw ethnic mobilization, setting the Luo nation against the Kikuyu nation, the Kalenjin nation against. But we have exerted a lot of pressure from below. The Kenyan people, through their respective arms of government and through mass actions and demonstrations, have rejected the politics of ethnic mobilization. So that is why these elections was dominated by certain rhetorics around economic model. In fact, the Ruto's infamous bottoms-up approach was sold out as, as a way to save the poor people from the dynasty. But it only ended in rhetoric, because we have not seen any policy issues. Ruto, for a fact, comes from the oppressing class, from the rich minority class in this country. And if indeed he means well for the poor people, then he has to commit the class suicide, surrender all the wealth and the land that he has accumulated on the back of the poor people. And on the other side, we saw Raila's offensive, talking about state welfareism. And he was talking about giving 6,000 shillings to the poor people. But how so, when you have not told us where you're going to get 6,000 shillings to give the poor people? Because Raila himself is not willing to expropriate the expropriators, because he is a class of those people who have been expropriating the working class. And in fact, now they came to even expose themselves more in the post-election, when they all went, to pay homage to the United States Embassy and the Western allies. And you could see this, the managers of this country coming out to try and say they are defending the Kenyan democracy. But in actual sense, they are not defending any democracy in Kenya. They are here to represent imperialist interest and to continue to, slaughter the poor people and get each and every blood from the poor people in this country, to export it as capital to their countries, and only use us to, to consume low substandard materials that is manufactured in their countries, use us as a source of cheap labor. So we can see that the convergence between Raila and Ruto was imperialism, was their view about seeing that the United States capitalist project, led by their Western allies, as the alpha and omega, or, as a do-it-all for our country.